Hello and welcome. Good evening and greetings. Welcome to this, the final reading in this, our 19th season of the Contemporary Writers Series at Aquinas College. My name is Linda Nemec Foster. I'm an alum of the college, and along with my husband Tony, we founded the series in 1997. A couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to tell you first. Please, any device you have in your pocket or your hot little hand or your purse, please turn it off. Thank you so much. Also, we will be, after Ed Hirsch's reading, there will be a short Q&A, about a 10-minute Q&A, and afterwards, if you'd like to buy books, they're available. Mr. Hirsch will be signing books out by where the book table is, so please keep that in mind. Next year, we mark our 20th season by having 4 of our previous writers return to campus for repeat engagements. On September 14, we'll have poet Clarence Major. On November 16, creative nonfiction writer Judith Ortiz Cofer. On February 8, poet and memoirist Luis Rodriguez. And on April 19, novelist and poet Naomi Shihab-Nye. But tonight is a special one for me because I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Edward Hirsch. He has built a reputation as an attentive and elegant writer and reader of poetry. Hirsch has published 9 books of poems, including Wild Gratitude, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award, Lay Back the Darkness, Special Orders, The Living Fire, new and selected poems, and Gabriel, a poem, a powerful elegy for his son that, in my mind, is one of the most bravest, intense poems ever written. He has also published 5 prose books about poetry, including the bestseller, How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry. And as I told Ed earlier, I fell in love with that book. It's a great book. He is an acclaimed advocate for poetry and essays that have championed the work of poets from Poland, Ireland, Greece, and Chile, to name a few. His numerous awards include an NEA Fellowship, a MacArthur Award, and the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. He has taught at Wayne State University and the University of Houston. Currently, he is president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and he lives in New York City. There are 3 instances in my life where Hirsch's poetry and his love of poetry have influenced me. When I lived in Detroit from 1974 to 82, I heard about this poet who was teaching at Wayne State. Soon after his first book was published, I heard Edward Hirsch read from that book, For the Sleepwalkers, and I was immediately drawn to his poems that were haunting and original, quiet and bold. He created poems that I wanted to read and reread. Fast forward to the mid-1990s when I was visiting the Art Institute of Chicago with my friend, the poet Liesl Mueller. That afternoon, Hirsch was giving a talk complete with slides and a projector. Those were the days before PowerPoint, my children, about a new book he had edited, Transforming Vision, Writers on Art. It was a beautiful book that coupled noted writers such as Stuart Dybek, Li-Young Lee, and Joyce Carol Oates with works of art from the Institute's permanent collection. This book very much influenced my perception of ekphrastic writing, or writing inspired by visual art. The third instance took place on the other side of the world in July of 2003, when my family and I were visiting my relatives in Poland, and this is a true story. I was hiking in the mountains in southern Poland when one of my cousins told me about an American poet who was organizing this wonderful poetry festival in Krakow. I knew it was Ed Hirsch, even before the 2 words left Pavel's lips. Do you see a pattern here? And the next day, I heard Ed give a superb reading with Adam Zagiewski, one of Poland's leading poets. But what happened the day after that was even better. Ed invited me to come to an extraordinary event, bilingual in Polish and English, bilingual readings by acclaimed poets including W.S. Merwin, Ivan Bolan, Zagiewski, Hirsch, and Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz. After the reading, I was able to meet Miłosz, one of my poetry heroes. You made that happen for me, Ed. His generous heart is matched by his generous approach to poetry. It gives us an unflinching insight into who we are, with subjects that range from philosophers to mystics to jazz musicians to Dutch painters to Gertrude Stein giving a lecture on love. The breadth of his work reflects a poetry that questions, probes, and embraces all that it means to be human. Please help me in welcoming Ed Hirsch.
Hi, everybody. That was so nice. I was enjoying it so much. I'm sorry to have to read now. Terrific weather. I know it's always like this in Michigan. I remember living here. Wayne, we used to call it recruiting weather. You immediately try and get job candidates in and pretend that it's always like this. Thank you for coming. I'm really glad to be with you, even if it was required by your teachers. It's reminding me, the way the setup is reminding me of when I was in Chattanooga. I was at this community college, and it was a bigger room than this, and everyone was sitting in the front, and there were two kids sitting way in the back. So before the reading, I went back and said, "What are you guys doing here?" And they said, "Oh, we came to hear the poetry reading." And I go, "Well, why'd you come?" They said, "Well, our teacher said we could get extra credit if we came to the reading." And I said, "Yeah, but why are you sitting so far in the back?" They said, "Oh, as soon as this guy starts, we're going to sneak out." So after that, I can never look at the back of a room in the same way. Cotton candy. We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time. And I ate cotton candy, that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more. But I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers through the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. This is called Branch Library. I'm trying to get back in this poem to the feeling I had when I first started writing poetry when I was in high school, and I'd go to the library and I'd move between the stacks where I was reading and the tables where I was writing. Branch Library. I wish I could find that skinny, long-beaked boy who perched in the branches of the old Branch Library. He spent the Sabbath flying between the wobbly stacks and the flimsy wooden tables on the second floor, pecking at nuts, nesting in broken spines, scratching notes under his own corner patch of sky. I'd give anything to find that birdie boy again, bursting out into the dusky blue afternoon with his satchel of scrawls and scribbles, radiating heat, singing with joy. This poem is called Fast Break. It's a basketball poem. When I taught at Wayne, My closest friend was a guy named Dennis Turner who had taught film with me. And we were in the English department. He taught film, and I was teaching poetry. And we used to play hoops together 2 or 3 times a week, talk about the English department, then throw elbows at each other, thinking about department meetings. And then we go to department meetings and talk about basketball. Anyway, Dennis died of liver cancer in 1984, and I wanted to write a poem for him, and this is what I wrote. Fast break, in memory of Dennis Turner, 1946 to 1984. A hook shot kisses the rim and hangs there helplessly, but doesn't drop. And for once our gangly starting center boxes out his man and times his jump perfectly, gathering the orange leather from the air like a cherished possession and spinning around to throw a strike to the outlet who's already shoveling an underhand pass toward the other guard, scissoring past a flat-footed defender who looks stunned and nailed to the floor in the wrong direction, trying to catch sight of a high gliding dribble and a man letting the play develop in front of him in slow motion, almost exactly like a coach's drawing on the blackboard, both forwards racing down the court the way that forwards should, fanning out and filling the lanes in tandem, moving together as brothers, passing the ball between them without a dribble, without a single bounce hitting the hardwood, until the guard finally lunges out and commits to the wrong man, while the power forward explodes past them in a fury, taking the ball into the air by himself now and laying it gently against the glass for a layup, but losing his balance in the process, inexplicably falling, hitting the floor with a wild, headlong motion for the game he loved like a country, and swiveling back to see an orange blur floating perfectly through the net. I thought I'd read you one more elegy and sports poem. It's called Execution. It's about my high school football coach. He mentioned poetry only one time. I mean, in the football locker room, and I grew up in Chicago, in the locker room, you didn't talk about poetry that much. Football didn't seem like a good idea. So he was. It was a halftime of a game. He hadn't acknowledged that I was writing or anything like that. But at halftime of a game, in the first half, they were running a play. I was playing defensive end, and the other team was running a play. And the play went like this: the end would block me, then the guard would pull out and hit me, then the fullback would run at me, and then the other guy with the ball, the halfback, would run by me. And so they ran that play, I don't know, it was working 20 times in the first half. So at halftime in the locker room, I was sitting there, I was splattered with mud, I had my helmet by my side. My coach, this huge guy, picked up a garbage can and started bouncing it on the ground. Boom, boom, boom. Hirsch, stop thinking about poetry. That was the extent of his literary reference. The last time I saw my high school football coach, he had cancer stenciled into his face like pencil marks from the sun, like intricate drawings on the chalkboard, small X's and O's that he copied down in a neat numerical hand before practice in the morning. By day's end, the board was a spider web of options and counters, blasts and sweeps, a constellation of players shining under his favorite word, execution, underlined in the upper right-hand corner of things. He believed in football like a new religion and had perfect, unquestioning faith in the fundamentals of blocking and tackling, the idea of warfare without suffering or death, the concept of teammates moving in harmony like the planets. And yet our awkward adolescent bodies were always canceling the flawless beauty of Saturday afternoons in September, falling away from the particular grace of autumn, the clear weather, the ideal game he imagined. And so he drove us through punishing drills on weekday afternoons and doubled our practice time and challenged us to hammer him with forearms and devised elaborate last-second plays, a flea flicker, a triple reverse, to save us from defeat. Almost always they worked. He despised losing and loved winning more than his own body, maybe even more than himself. But the last time I saw him, he looked wobbly and stunned by illness. And I remembered the game in my senior year when we met a downstate team who loved hitting more than we did, who battered us all afternoon with a vengeance, who destroyed us with timing and power, with deadly impersonal authority, machine-like fury, perfect execution. This is called Black Rhinoceros. The black rhinoceros at Brookfield Zoo, eating sweet potatoes, carrots, and bread, looked like my uncle's extended family crowding around the table at Thanksgiving. Mrs. Mulvihill suddenly started crying on the second grade bus, which often stalled, and the next day we had a substitute teacher who said that rhinos have poor eyesight and swivel their tube-shaped ears in all directions so they can hear their enemies approaching, lions and people who carve their horns into daggers or mash them into pain relievers. My parents bought my shoes on discount at Walensky and Levy, and so whenever I raised either foot, my soul said, damaged. That's why I kept my feet close to the floor. When Mrs. Mulvihill returned, she wore dark dresses and told us that the black rhinoceros is the same muddy color as the white rhinoceros, which is strange if you think about it, and we did. What does it feel like to have two horns tilting up on a huge head, Mr. Rhinoceros? You lumber around in your skin of armor like an exiled general or a grounded unicorn. Everyone knows that a pachyderm in peril would still rather live in the open savanna. We can't tell if you're trumpeting forward or backward in your scrubby house. There's an Edward Hopper painting called Early Sunday Morning, and that's where I got the title for this poem. I used to mock my father and his chums for getting up early on Sunday morning and drinking coffee at a local spot, but now I'm one of those chumps. No one cares about my old humiliations, but they go on dragging through my sleep like a string of empty tin cans rattling behind an abandoned car. It's like this. Just when you think you've forgotten that red-haired girl who left you stranded in a parking lot 40 years ago, you wake up early enough to see her disappearing around the corner of your dream on someone else's motorcycle, roaring onto the highway at sunrise. And so now I'm sitting in a dimly lit cafe full of early morning risers, where the windows are covered with soot and the coffee is warm and bitter. Self-portrait. I live between my heart and my head, like a married couple who can't get along. I live between my left arm, which is swift and sinister, and my right, which is righteous. I live between a laugh and a scowl and voted against myself, a two-party system. My left leg dawdled or danced along, my right cleaved to the straight and narrow. My left shoulder was like a stripper on vacation. My right stood upright as a Roman soldier. Let's just say that my left side was the organ donor and leave my private parts alone. But as for my eyes, which are two shades of brown, well, Dionysus, meet Apollo. Look at Eve raising her left eyebrow while Adam puts his right foot down. No one expected it to survive, but divorce seemed out of the question. I suppose my left hand and my right hand will be clasped over my chest in the coffin, and I'll be reconciled at last. I'll be whole again. Some young poets in Austin set up this series where they recorded poets reading their poems, and then they animated them and drew around it, and they did self-portrait. And I thought it was kind of cool. I went to the opening, and so they had me reading just the way I read to you, and then they had a drawing of, your left side is doing, right side is doing that. But at the end, they drew a coffin around me like this, and I was standing there like this, and it seemed kind of sobering. Just saying. I didn't enjoy it that much after that. This is called A Partial History of My Stupidity. I mean, you're young, so you could still do the whole thing. But you get to be my age, it's too hard. It's too long. I didn't want to write an epic poem, so I wrote a short one. It's sort of like volume 3, chapter 5. Traffic was heavy coming off the bridge, and I took the road to the right, the wrong one, and got stuck in the car for hours. Most nights I rushed out into the evening without paying attention to the trees, whose names I didn't know, or the birds, which flew heedlessly on. I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along like a tiger that wanted to spring, but was still afraid of the wildness within. The iron bars seemed invisible to others, but I carried a cage around inside me. I cared too much what other people thought and made remarks I shouldn't have made. I was silent when I should have spoken. Forgive me, philosophers. I read the Stoics but never understood them. I felt that I was living the wrong life, spiritually speaking. While halfway around the world, thousands of people were being slaughtered, some of them by my countrymen. So I walked on, distracted, lost in thought, and forgot to attend to those who suffered far away, nearby. Forgive me, faith, for never having any. I did not believe in God, who eluded me. The sweetness. The times my sad heart knew a little sweetness come back to me now. The coffee shop in Decatur, the Waffle House in Macon. The highway signs pointed to our happiness. The greasy spoons and gleaming truck stops were the stations of our pilgrimage. Remember the flock of Baptist women flying off the bus and gathering at the bridge over the river, singing with praise? Wasn't that us staggering past the riverboats, eating homemade fudge at the county fair, and devouring each other's body? They come back to me now, delicious love, the times my sad heart knew a little sweetness. This is a poem for my father. It's an elegy. My father sold corrugated cartons. It's called Special Orders. My father likes special orders rather than standard orders because he got paid more for the special orders. And because if you're a box salesman, if you get a special order, you can design the box rather than it's just being prefab. So he liked those. Give me back my father, walking the halls of Wertheimer Box and Paper Company with sawdust clinging to his shoes. Give me back his tape measure and his keys, his drafting pencil and his order forms. Give me his daydreams on lined paper. I don't understand this uncontainable grief. Whatever you had that never fit, whatever else you needed, believe me, my father, who wanted your business, would squat down at your side and sketch you a container for it. Troubadour Song. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and hummed a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. I dreamed I mounted a horse along an empty beach where we galloped far away till I was out of reach. We trotted past the lighthouse abandoned on the dunes and paused by a small stable that was now in ruins. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and made a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. We rode to the starkest edge of nowhere by the sea. The horse was all that remained of what I'd longed to be. We had somewhere deep to rest and nothing left to see, and so the two of us walked into the cemetery. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and sang a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. So I've written a book-length poem about my son Gabriel, and I thought I'd just read you a few sections from it. It's all one poem, so I'm just reading you some excerpts, but they're intact as units. The population of his feelings could not be governed by the authorities. He had reasons why reason disobeyed him and voted him out of office. Anxiety, his constant companion, made it difficult to rest. Unruly party of one, forget about truces or compromises. The barricades will be stormed. Every day was an emergency. Every day called for another emergency meeting of the cabinet. In his country, there were scenes of spectacular carnage. Hurricanes welcomed him. He adored typhoons and tornadoes, furies unleashed, houses lifted up and carried to the sea, uncontained, uncontainable. Unbolt the doors, fling open the gates. Here he comes, chaotic wind of the gods. He was trouble, but he was our trouble. Mr. Impulsive walked out of class when he did not like what the teacher said. It was boring. Mr. Impulsive scurried out in a storm wearing shorts and a wife beater. Soon he was shivering. The neighbors complained to the landlord, complained to me, but Mr. Impulsive could not be bothered to close the gate. Mr. Impulsive left the house without his keys. I don't know how many times he camped out on the front stoop. One night he convinced a neighbor to shimmy the lock with a credit card. He was never locked out again. Mr. Impulsive will not be sleeping at home. He'd rather stay out and crash wherever he finds himself at 5 a.m. He could be oddly well-mannered to the parents of his friends. He was usually welcome. From the notebook of Mr. Impulsive, it is better to sneak through a side door than to wait in line like a sucker. It is not necessary to get directions. It's much better to head out right now. Time doesn't matter. These were the antics of Mr. Impulsive, who never knew where he was going until he got there. From the storybook of bluster and bad judgment, from the annals of loneliness, from the history of kids he met on the street in special programs, it was dangerous to stay in Amherst. Lord of misadventure, I'm scared of rounding him up and turning him into a story. God of scribbles and erasures, I hope he shines through like a Giacometti portrait. I keep scraping the canvas and painting him over again, but he keeps slipping away. He was like a spider preyed on by other spiders and older insects. Sweet venom, his arrivals were swift and his departures sudden. I couldn't understand how he lifted the shower door right off its hinges. When Gabriel cooked, the flames rose too high and the fire alarm sounded. When the fire alarm sounded, he tore it off the wall and left the wires dangling. He liked to kick back and remember the time we were riding home in a taxicab on the West Side Highway and my mother offered to take him to a strip club for his 21st birthday. What's wrong with that, she wanted to know. Why couldn't they celebrate together? That's just what you want, he bellowed, going for a lap dance with Grandma. He liked to kick back and declare he wanted to track down his birth mother to see if he really had Celtic blood. He liked to kick back and tell my family about the time he saw an American Hasidic Jewish reggae musician at Hampshire College. He saw Nicolas Cage going up an escalator in a movie theater and turned to his friends. I hate Nicolas Cage. He has such a big head. He liked to kick back and tell us how much he liked weed and shrooms. How bad could it be for you, he said. It comes out of the ground. He liked to kick back and roll a spliff with his friends at night. He always liked to go higher and higher. We're here, he'd say, lifting his hand to the middle of his chest, but we need to go here, he continued on, and raised his hand up to his neck. Friedrich Luikart wrote 425 poems after his two youngest children died from scarlet fever within 16 days of each other in 1833 and 1834. He could not cope and often thought they'd gone out for a while. They'll be home soon, he told himself to tell his wife. They're only taking a long walk. Mahler scored 5 of those poems in 1901 and 1904 for a vocalist and an orchestra to break your heart. As soon as I heard the plaintive oboe and the descending movement of the horn and the lyric baritone entering, I felt I should not be listening to Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing Kindertotenlieder with the Berlin Philharmonic. Mahler's wife was superstitious and thought he was chancing disaster with songs on the death of children. Now the sun wants to rise so brightly as if nothing terrible had happened overnight. The tragedy happened to me alone. Mahler knew he never could have written them after his 4-year-old daughter died from scarlet fever 3 years later. He said he felt sorry for himself, that he needed to write these songs, and for the world that would listen to them. I stood at the damaged site across the street from my house and watched a steel ball crashing into the homeless shelter abandoned on Dean Street, all the people scattered. It takes tremendous force to weaken a building and turn bricks into rubble. It doesn't take long. The crane swung around and pitched the heavy ball into the guts of the structure, holding its side like a wounded veteran. The hard hats gathered to watch the pendulum swing into the concrete body of a building slated for demolition so there could be progress. I was against the project and riveted to the wreckage. Time and again, the fighter wavered and finally collapsed. I did not stay to see the building broken down into debris and then carted away. Some nights I could not tell if he was the wrecking ball or the building it crashed into. He breezed into the office with his girlfriend and hit me up for extra money because of the storm pounding across the Atlantic Ocean. He was heading to the store to buy food so they wouldn't starve to death, ha ha. Love you, he coughed and kissed me. See you next week. He was out the door like 1,000 other times. Some people were nervous, others festive when we closed for the day and told everyone to buy supplies. Is this the apocalypse line? Somebody asked the disorderly crowd outside the hardware store on First Avenue. The apocalypse line was getting longer. We should forget about power downtown, the spokesman for Con Ed said, when Hurricane Irene hit North Carolina and started to churn up the East Coast. The city decided to evacuate 370,000 people from the low-lying areas of Manhattan. My friends in Zone A boarded their windows and stormed out. On the local news, I watched some idiots sitting on the beach and working on their tans in Asbury Park. Here comes Irene bearing down on us. It's time to get out of the apocalypse line. When I'm standing in line at the DMV and the stoner next to me starts ranting about his parole officer. The dude has anger management issues. He's profiling me. I couldn't get there because my grandmother was sick. When his buddy rolls into Big Nick's wearing cargo shorts and an Oscar the Grouch t-shirt, and I slip him a $50 bill. When one of his goofball friends swears he will never take hard drugs again and then drops 3 tabs of acid and winds up in an institution in Tennessee. When I recite Surprised by Joy, Impatient as the Wind, and think about Wordsworth's daughter Catherine, his 6-year-old son Thomas, his daughter Dora, whose death caused him to quit. When someone's nephew, someone's brother's oldest son, a drunken teenager, gets stuck on the railroad tracks. When I see fresh-faced soldiers hurrying off the plane in Atlanta and everyone begins to clap. When the truck swerves into my lane. When lightning strikes a tree while I'm walking across a field. When the young anesthesiologist puts a needle into my arm and I start to go under. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves, though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief, I'm not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. This is called God and Me. The stars look like a broken belt glittering over the lakes and mountains. The moon looks like a tilted crown. Down here, there's a whole lot of racket in churches and bedrooms. Some good folks are speaking in tongues and raising the rafters. I wonder if the Lord ever gets tired of so much flattery from the fundamentalists. He probably likes it better than all the complaints and entreaties. I'm standing up to listen, but he has nothing to say to the atheists. It'd be nice to believe that heaven is like a schoolyard in which everyone gets chosen, even the laggards. My friends are seekers and exiles who won't desert the stories. Me, I can't give him up, but I can't believe in him either. It's a one-sided relationship, I without thou. He has whole galaxies to worry about. I don't suppose he gets too worked up. My puny self is more real to me than his immense non-being. I'm a tiny void with attributes, with my own little river of tears. But what is he who fills the world with trees and stars and leaves us alone with our wars and atrocities, our deadly human nature, our sad dominion over the fish and the fowl? Look, no one knows why there's so much silence in the upper spheres and so much suffering down here. The Almighty skipped over our houses. This is called Variations on a Psalm. It's from a passage, Psalm 77, passage, the second verset. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. And I would not be comforted when I was in distress. I sought the Lord. I did not know why I did not believe while I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted in my distress. I sought the Lord. I would not pray. I would not call on him, stretched out with my untiring hands. And comforted I would not be when I was in distress without the Lord. I stretched out tireless on the bed. My hands were sleepless in despair, and I would not be comforted in my distress. I sought the Lord. I could not find him. At night I stretched out untiring hands like a penitent, O Lord of disbelief, and I would not be comforted. The keening. All morning he heard a faint thrumming in the distance, a wail, a wild cry, atonal, primitive, almost too far away to hear, a frequency nearly beyond us now, yet ours alone. All morning he tried to blot it out and follow the news breaking like a fog over the day, but he kept hearing it rising and coming closer, a chant, a plea from the dead suddenly burning inside him, one of the grief-stricken ones, wearing a button-down with a tie and walking the hall with a notebook as if he belonged here, as if he had something else to report. I'm going to close with a poem called I Was Never Able to Pray. I hope you have some questions for me about poetry and we can have a little chat. Wheel me down to the shore where the lighthouse was abandoned and the moon tolls in the rafters. Let me hear the wind paging through the trees and see the stars flaring out one by one like the forgotten faces of the dead. I was never able to pray, but let me inscribe my name in the book of waves and then stare into the dome of a sky that never ends and see my voice sail into the night. Thank you. Thank you. Questions, complaints? Save those for Linda later.
We're going to have 2 microphones here for Q&A. I'm going to leave this one here, so please step up to the mics. We do need all questions to go through the microphones, please.
Okay. I was watching actually one of your interviews about how you really liked the lyrical ballad, how you were experimenting with fiction and poetry, and then you realized like you could have that emotional heightened sensation in poetry. So I was wondering, what really inspired you to have that kind of rhapsodic kind of inspiration in your poetry, like either positive or negative?
He's saying your poems seem like a little too emotional, like
Well, no.
just teasing you, just teasing you. You're so excessive, why would you do it? Is that sort of a paraphrase of the question?
I really admire
I'm teasing you, I can't resist.
what kind of inspired that thought?
It seemed to me that if poetry couldn't contain the deepest, most excessive feeling, what could? And later I found all kinds of things that people said, like Marina Tsvetaeva, a great Russian poet, said, there can't be too much of the lyric is itself the too much. And it seemed to me that poetry was the container for the deepest emotion, for despair and ecstasy both, the pits and the heights. It didn't have to be that. You could also hit the middle register if that you were so inclined, but that whereas, say, the novel, because of its time and because of its social character, could give you characters in action over time, poetry could do something outside of time. And that the compression of it and the intensity of the language could mesmerize you in such a way that you could hit the kind of fathomless depths, and that rhythm would be a way of doing that. And so the question is, can you figure out a way to do that technically? Can you find a container for what is otherwise uncontainable? But it seemed to me that poetry should be able to do that. And I found poems that spoke to me and that sang to me and that seemed to do that. And it seemed to me this was one of the things that poetry could do. And then I think what register you hit is dependent on your temperament. And so mine is extreme. And so it seemed to me that I wanted to try and find a poetry, a format, a way to write that could honor what I felt. And that's a lifelong task. Thank you. You could I'll paraphrase it.
I have a question while she's walking up. You can
Okay,
keep walking
you walk
up.
up
yeah.
and yes.
I'm just wondering. Oh, I'm standing up now. Okay, I'm right
Where
here.
are
Yep,
you?
I'm right here. I'm right to your left. My right, your left.
Okay,
yeah.
yes.
I'm just wondering. When I write, sometimes I struggle to stay authentic, and I'm wondering, do you ever struggle to be authentic in your writing?
What do you mean, why is it hard to be authentic?
I think like sometimes maybe I feel pressure to. I don't want to talk about my writing necessarily, but I wonder maybe because a lot of people read your poetry, do you ever feel pressure when in your writing to be authentic, or do you ever struggle to stay authentic?
I mean, are you saying that my poetry is so inauthentic that?
That's what I'm saying. It's just not really real to me.
That's
yeah.
what I thought.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of technical skill, but it takes a lot of courage to write poetry. And one of the mistakes that you can make in trying to write poetry, one of the worst mistakes you can make is trying to make yourself look good. But naturally, there's a temptation to do that because you want to present well. But in fact, that almost always leads to bad poetry. What leads to good poetry is convicting yourself, but that's hard. So not everyone has the stomach for it, for the exposure and for the extremity of it and for turning the knife against yourself. I think that's always an issue. Poetry focuses on just those instances which consciousness tries to slide by and elude. That is, your consciousness doesn't want to face certain things that are really painful. I think poetry goes to them. And if you can handle it, then it can reward you with its scrutinizing view. You can't really worry about how you look in a poem and how other people will take it. What you try to do is get it down so that it's truthful as that you can make it. And that's your job. And you're also making art. You're not just writing confessions. You're also transforming it into a form that will be like packing it in salt. There will be the delivery system. And you hope that the form you create, the container you can create, also creates some distance and some structure that gives particular meaning and delivery to other people, because you're not just writing it for yourself. So you decide that you can handle that or you can't, but I think it's required. And that's why I think courage is so important in terms of facing the blank page and facing yourself and facing the abyss of yourself, really. Turns out I have a taste for it.
You already kind of answered my question when you answered hers, but it's a little bit more specific. Earlier you talked about how poetry mainly consists of the highest peaks of someone's life and the lowest depths. And I've noticed that the vast majority of poetry, at least that I've read and that you've presented, comes from the lowest depths. Do you think that's because of what you were talking about with something that the consciousness can accept? Or, I mean, why do you think it's necessary, if it is necessary, that poetry mainly consists of the lowest depths in people's lives?
Probably I'm tilting it too much if that's the case, because there's also joy.
Well, I mean, just negative in general.
Because poetry is a form of literature and literature thrives on conflict, it's probably a little easier to make a dramatic poem out of struggle rather than out of happiness. I don't quite believe this, but Philip Larkin said happiness writes white. And what he means by that is that happiness goes blank on you when you try to write about it. It's not dramatic. I don't think that's quite true, and there are poets of ecstatic joy. Whitman is one of them. Christopher Smart is another. The prophetic poets, when they're not melancholy about what's going to happen, can be quite joyful. as in the Song of Songs. And so that's one iteration of poetry that I think is really important. It's not such a modern one, but it does exist. And I think it would be wrong to poetry and wrong to life if you said that happiness did not also exist and that joy was not also part of what we write about. You should. My work is skewed dramatically in a certain kind of way because of its elegiac nature. And then also I'd say that although this is the reading that I gave is true to my work, because I know that I plan to read some poems to you from Gabriel, I didn't feel I should just drop you into that cold. So I tried to plan a reading that would lead sort of naturally from certain feelings to that poem. And so that's where the arc is moving towards the elegiac, if that answers your question.
It does. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. She basically said, "You're so gloomy," but she did it in such a nice way.
Right here. Hi. I was wondering if your editing process is inspirational or more just like you have to work at it. Like, do you get the words that just kind of come to you from inspiration, or do you? I mean, like, when you look back on it, do you have to really look at it and look at it like surgery, sort of?
She's saying that you maybe should look at your poems a little more closely, because they're very dependent on inspiration, but maybe you should like revise some of them. Is that a fair paraphrase? It'd be nice to think that you could just rely on inspiration, but it's just not the case. Robert Frost liked to say how many things have to happen to you before something occurs to you. You do need something to occur to you, and some people call that inspiration. You get an idea or a flash, and sometimes you do things that you didn't expect. But a lot of it is labor. A lot of it is revising and thinking it through, and I mean, I don't mean to make it seem like an unhappy process, but it's a difficult one as you try to articulate what you mean to say, what you're trying to say, and try to wrestle it into some kind of shape or form. So revision is not just inspiration, although one hopes for it, but in the meantime, it's important to read and think and revise and try and get your poem into some kind of a form. And that, William Carlos Williams said, a poem is a small or large machine made out of words. It's useful to think of a poem as a machine, not just as an emotion. Because a machine is like, that's not sentimental. And Williams said there's nothing sentimental about a machine. All the parts have to do their work. So even if the subject matter is intensely emotional, the machinery still has to work. Yeah. Even when I'm reading you my elegy, the poems are in 3-line the stanzas are without punctuation. They're in 3-line stanzas. There's 10 per section. There's still kind of a form. It doesn't just come out the way, every once in a while you get lucky and something does happen and it comes out pretty easily because you're ready and you're prepared. But mostly you do the work of your craft. The oldest word for poetry in Greek is poiesis, which means maker. A poet is a maker and a poem is a made thing. So the making isn't inspirational, it's work. Hopefully it's joyous work. It's the pleasure of creating something and being inside it, and there's the pleasure of craft. And then hopefully something occurs to you and you get some inspiration. Randall Jarrell said that a poet is someone who stands out in rainstorms. A good poet is someone who gets hit by lightning 6 times. A great poet is someone who gets hit by lightning 12 times. Now, for me, the moral of the story is you still have to go stand in the rain. And if you don't stand in the rain and do your work, you're not going to get hit by lightning. So inspiration comes to the prepared mind when it comes to the writing of poetry. So,
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Tough insult, though.
I was curious how important you think imagination is in poetry and why.
I can't even begin to tell you. He goes, he's saying that, I wish your poems had a little more imagination, and I wish you valued it a little more, and that's why I'd like you to talk about this subject. Is that a fair? Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid, yes. I thought I was joking, but you're
Only a little.
Only a little, yeah, only a little. So this is a very big subject. I'm not touting my own book, but I wrote a book called The Poet's Glossary, which defines all the poetry terms, and one of the terms is imagination. And it's got a long history in poetry. Depending on what moment you dip into in the history of poetry, poets have different things to say about imagination. Beginning with the Romantic poets in the 19th century, they gave the greatest weight to imagination as a feature of poetry. If you would, say, interviewed John Donne, and you asked John Donne about imagination, he most likely would have said it's an important element in poetry along with many others. But if you asked John Keats about imagination, he would say it's the fundamental feature of poetry. And so ever since the Romantic poets, ever since Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Byron Shelley, and especially William Blake, imagination has been the largest value for poets. The modernists tempered it with a certain kind of irony. But nonetheless, I think for us, ever after, imagination has been one of the crucial ingredients to define what poetry is beyond rational logic. What is it that distinguishes poetry from philosophy, say? And I would say that one of the things that distinguishes it is the element of the irrational and the unconscious and the imagination. So it's a really good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really getting into it now.
So I think everybody knows that poetry is usually a pretty personal thing for the poet. How do you handle criticism against your poems? Do you have trouble taking it? Does it hurt personally, or is it something that you can be mostly detached from and say, I see what you're saying?
Are you preparing to say something to me that's going to hurt my feelings and that you're like, yeah, maybe. Yeah. Seeing how I could take it. Everyone handles it differently. No one likes to be criticized. It's one thing, there are different kinds of criticism. There's the criticism of your peers. There's the criticism of your friends when you hand them a poem and you want them to help you make it better. There's the nasty review that you get in the book. My feeling about this is if you can't take it, you can't publish. That when you publish a poem, when you put it into the world, it no longer belongs to you entirely. It is vulnerable to criticism. And you may not like it, but you have to be able to not die over it. I mean, I know a lot of terrible stories of people who get a bad review and they go to bed for 6 months. I also recently heard about someone who won a big fellowship, and she said it made her nauseous and she had to go to bed for 2 days. That was really weird. But anyway, no one likes criticism. At different levels, criticism is crucial to get better. You need it to improve. And then when you're in the larger world and you're publishing, you need to put on your armor and not take it too personally. My feeling is if criticism can make you stop, if criticism can hurt your feelings so much that you don't want to write anymore, then you shouldn't be publishing your work. You need to be immune. Now, no one likes getting criticized, no one likes getting blasted, but you have to learn to live with it as part of publishing your work. Because once you send it out in the world, you can no longer control it. And that's part of what it is, to send it forward and make it a public document.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One more question?
Really?
Yeah.
Too bad. They're silencing us.
Your poems are so emotional and so personal, and I guess my question is, how do you prepare to be so vulnerable to your readers or to read your poems in front of a group of people like this?
Probably a bad idea, right? Is that what you're saying?
No.
Yes. I don't know if you can prepare. You are making art, at least you can tell yourself you're trying to, and that what you're making is not exactly you, it's not exactly the same thing. The persona that you present in your poems is not exactly the persona that you have when you sit down and eat breakfast. W.B. Yeats said there's always a phantasmagoria. But I don't want to evade your question. I think it can be painful, and you sort of decide whether you can read it or not. And there was about a year where I never read from my book Gabriel when it came out, and only recently have I tried reading from it and see how it feels. I'm still not sure. But my feeling is, if you believe in it, if you write it and you believe in it and you publish it and you send it in the world, then perhaps you want to stand by it. You want to do it justice if you believe in it. So I just decided that it's part of the work, that if you're going to write these poems, if you're going to bother to write the poems, if you're going to agonize over writing these poems, you're going to spend your life writing them as I do, then you want to stand behind what they say and what they are, and you want to represent them. And so that exposes you, but okay, that exposes you. That's part of the work. That's part of the work of poetry. And is it so bad in our culture for a man in our culture to stand up and say, I have deep feelings? It seems to me maybe a good idea for the nature of our culture, but in the world we live in. But anyway, that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I believe in the poems, and I'm willing to stand behind them, and people know things about you then because of it. Now, I don't want to pretend that everyone in my circle is cool with it, because they're not. Not everyone thinks it's so great that I'm writing these poems that are so personal for everyone, and because a lot of people are involved. It's not just me. You're exposing not just yourself, but you're exposing your family and people around you. In my case, my son and my ex-wife and all his friends. A lot of people are exposed in these poems. It's a complicated moral decision of what you want to decide and what you want to do, but I've decided to stand behind it. And so I just kind of brace myself for presenting it. So thank you. Thanks, everybody.